Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have Trump is wrong on price controls from WashingtonPost.com, posted by socialist or morons, and they added, please remove this economically illiterate idiot from office. And yeah, I would agree with that. I think price controls are very anti-libertarian and go against the free market. They might be well-intentioned, but like with a lot of other government programs, just because they're good-intentioned doesn't make them good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as they say. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Liberty and Justice for All has an asterisk now, posted by Slayer991, and that's a cross post from the Rationality Project subreddit. And they said, oh, do I have a question? First Amendment, freedom of assembly and speech. Federal agents in Minneapolis are tearing, gassing, pepper spraying, and arresting peaceful protesters and legal observers. A judge orders them to stop. The appeals court lifted the order for days. DHS called the restrictions a little ridiculous. First Amendment freedom of the press. The president is suing news outlets whose coverage he doesn't like, banning AP from the Oval Office over word choice, and requiring Pentagon reporters to pledge they won't gather any information nor not expressly authorized for released. First Amendment, Establishment Clause, federal agencies are hosting We Are Blessed to Share a Nation and a Savior, though for official government accounts. The administration established a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias, and the Religious Liberty Commission, staffed almost entirely by evangelical Christians. This isn't for religious freedom, it's state religion. Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. The founders wrote the Fourth Amendment because the British used general warrants to search colonial homes without judicial oversight. ICE is now entering homes with administrative warrants signed by DHS, not judges. We fought a revolution over this. Fifth and Sixth Amendments, due process. People are being arrested and detained without warrants signed by an independent judge. The due process they're offered. Immigration courts run by DOJ employees who report to the executive branch, not judiciary. So here's my question. If liberty and justice for all only applies when you agree with the people exercising it, was it ever a principle or just a preference? And yeah, my thoughts on that are, I do agree that, this administration is violating a ton of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but, that's pretty par for the course in Washington these days. Reddit didn't care when Biden or Obama did it. They care when Trump did it, and to be fair, they did care when Bush did it as well. But, it's very much like everything else, right? In group good, out group bad. I'm sure the second a Democrat takes back the reins of the state, Reddit will go back to justifying all the anti-constitutional and anti-Bill of Rights stuff they do. But right now, since the outgroup's in charge, it's the most important thing ever to them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have U.S. arrested Free who disrupted church over Minnesota immigration crackdown, arrested under the FACE Act, a law intended to protect those seeking to access abortion clinics and places of worship, from Barron's.com, posted by Gnome Sane. And yeah, personally, I don't think you should be storming someone's church and causing a scene there, especially during worship hours, even if they said, oh, one of the pastors might be an ICE agent. That's not going to be helpful for your movement. You shouldn't be storming buildings when, a lot of woke leftists say, oh, the January 6th was an insurrection, they need to be helpful, they need to be hopefully accountable, but then they justify stuff like this, and it's just going to show you, no principles, only teams. You shouldn't be storming churches during religious meetings. And yeah, even if one of the pastors there might work for ICE, that doesn't make it right. And that just goes to show you, if you want to justify storming whatever building you want to, justify doing whatever you want to, but you should be held accountable for when you want to if you storm a church during worshiping hours. And I personally don't know if the state should be the one holding accountable. I definitely do think you should face some sort of punishment for that. Let people worship in peace. Don't be an annoying woke leftist redditor and storm in during worshiping hours, even if you think, one of the pastors works for ICE. That doesn't make it right that you just storm people's religious services. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rahm Emanuel calls for age limit of 75 for president, Congress, and judges from NYTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally would agree with that. I think that's anti-democratic. Who's to say if people want to vote for someone over 75, I think they should be able to. But it's very much like term limits for me. Just because to term limits or go against democracy doesn't make them bad. I'm very thankful that Donald Trump is term limited right now because I've been hearing Orange Man bad every day in some form for well over a decade at this point, and it may be anti-democratic, but just because something's anti-democratic doesn't necessarily make it bad. With that being said, I don't think it really matters because elected officials like president, Congress, and judges, they're not really the ones running the show. It's mostly the deep state bureaucrats and alpha agencies like the NSA, FBI, and like they're really running the show, and that's important to remember as well. So yeah, personally, I could go either way here. If people want to vote for someone over 75, they should be able to. With that being said, I do think a lot of people over 75 don't have what it takes to be the president for that matter, even if the position is mostly just a figurehead one. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Massey currently at 79% odds to win primary according to Polymarket from Polymarket.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Thomas Massey subreddit. And yeah, I personally hope he wins. I don't really care for pretty much too many politicians, but Thomas Massey's one of the few decent ones we have. I don't agree with on everything. Like he supports the Jones Act, for example. Which makes it harder for international shipping to be done. But ultimately, I definitely do think he's one of the few principled people in Congress these days, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have thoughts on the border peace being centered around Israel from experts, posted by ExpertSpawn8267, and that's a cross post from the America's First Meme subreddit, and that looks like a tweet from Fox News. New President Trump says 59 countries are involved in the historic border peace mission, which aims to end the conflict in Gaza and force Hamas to give up its weapons. They have to give up their weapons. If they don't do that, it's going to be the end of them, Trump says. And yeah, I personally think the border peace is just more Trumpian theater. I don't think Gaza's anywhere close to being solved. It hasn't been anywhere close to being solved for decades now, and I don't think Trump's gonna tilt the scales one way or the other. He did mark himself as solving it, but it's pretty much an unsolvable situation because no one's going to be happy unless they get all everything they want, and both Israel and the Palestine want the entire area, and so neither of them will be happy until one of them is completely defeated, I would say, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have House Oversight Panel votes to hold Bill and Hillary Clinton in contempt of Congress from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the NPR subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think they should be held in contempt of Congress. But of course, Reddit, they're going to say, "Oh, Trump violates subpoenas. Why are they only holding Bill and Hillary in contempt?" And ultimately, I think they should all be held in contempt. But Reddit will always find a way to defend someone when they have a D next to their name, while always going after anyone who has an R next to their name for even the slightest offense. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Why Are So Many Quote-Unquote Libertarians Authoritarians, posted by Easy Does It, and that's a cross post from the Political Debate subreddit. And that post said, why are so many libertarians, classical liberals, small government conservatives, limited government conservatives, monarchists, and volunteerists raging authoritarians? This is a sincere, good faith question. I have my own hypotheses, but I'd like to hear it from you. And yeah, personally, I think, a lot of people are only libertarian in the sense that they like liberty for when it's on their terms. I do agree that a lot of libertarians can be overly authoritarian when it comes to simping for more right-leaning groups like the Republican Party, but you could say the same thing for a lot of left-leaning libertarians and something for the Democratic Party. Ultimately, I think libertarian positions, you gotta stand up for liberty, whether it's in-group or out-group coded. I personally think just because I personally agree with some more right-leaning positions, like we people should have the right to bear arms regardless of what side of the aisle they're on. And I also agree with some more left-leaning positions, like ICE is an authoritarian agency that we should be done away with, just like all the other alphabet agencies. And I think that's where what people need to remember is that being principled when it comes to being a libertarian doesn't mean being on the left or right and always picking sides. It means truly standing up for what you believe in regards to liberty. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Jared Kushner, in parentheses, alleged Mossad/Israeli agent and son of felon Carl Kushner, who hired a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law and film it and blackmail him, unveiled his quote-unquote master plan to redevelop Gaza on a bed of graves. And yeah, that looks like the thing from the Trump's Board of Peace. It looks like they're going to turn Gaza into like Miami Beach or something. I personally wouldn't really care for that, but ultimately, if they have the force to do so, I personally think this is just kind of marketing. That's all, but I don't think it's gonna get done. But if they want to do that, I think they should be able to. But I don't know how realistic that is without continuing the Gaza genocide or even escalating it for that matter. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have North Korea post, oops, sorry, wrong country. White House posts digitally altered image of woman arrested after ICE protest from TheGuardian.com, posted by Fear the Creeper, and they added, sorry for the mix-up, sometimes it's hard to tell the tyrants who post Photoshop propaganda apart, my bad. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Photoshop propaganda, but that's very much what government does. They try and always Photoshop and manipulate things to fit their narratives. And Reddit cares at this point because the government's the out group currently, but when the government's in group, they suddenly won't care about stuff like this. And that's why, I personally don't think you should be doing this, but, ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it wants to justify, and they have the legal monopoly and force to do so. And oftentimes, if there's no consequences, then, what they're going to keep on justifying it. And that's very much what you see with Donald Trump, he hasn't really ever had to face consequences for anything over the past decade, and that's why, he keeps getting away with stuff like this. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Trump says sometimes you need a dictator after alarming Davos speech from NewRepublic.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the Conservative Terrorism subreddit. And yeah, personally, I would disagree with that, but that's very much another Trumpian bait. A lot of Trump, I would say, is much more theater than it is actually anything else. I've been told that Trump's supposed to become literally worse than Hitler every day now for the past 10 or so years. And eventually, I don't think he's good, and I don't really like how he puts out all this bait like this. But eventually, you just kind of ignore it and move on to the next thing. It's like the boy who cried wolf. When you're constantly crying wolf, that, Trump's literally become Hitler, and he hasn't become, he's bad, but he's not quite literally at Hitler levels yet. Eventually just kind of move on to the next thing. Next, we have, this is government control, not private border action, posted by Fasty Rovina 739, and that's a crosspost from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And that looks like a meme. Sorry, but a few people decided that we can't let your kind in here, even though the majority are perfectly fine with it. And that looks like a bouncer at a club saying that. And I guess you're trying to apply it to the national situation. And that's personally why I would say the libertarian position on immigration is, ultimately, when you have a nation like the size of the United States, it can be hard to, restrict individual travel across the borders. That's why I think the libertarian position is you gotta have more voluntary collectives than forced collectivists. If you want to have like a small house-sized property, and when you want to invite who you want to invite on it and kick out anyone you don't like on it, I think that's fine. But right now, since we have a massive country that's the size of that's like half the size of takes up half the continent, it's much harder to do that. And I think the libertarian position is, ultimately, if you want to come here, they should be able to, but that doesn't give them the privileges like welfare or voting. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Americans Standing Up to the Fascists, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the Behind the Bastards subreddit. And that looks like a bunch of tweets from Margaret Killjoy on Blue Sky. And yeah, I guess she's just sharing her thoughts. She looks like she's someone from Minneapolis. And yeah, the person who originally posted it, shout out to Margaret just for sharing her thoughts from Blue Sky account from the past evening. And let's see what it says. I came to Minneapolis to report on what's going on, and one of the main questions I showed up was just what's scale of the resistance. After all, we're all used to the news calling Portland a war zone where everyone's just some protest in one part of town. I got in late last night. First thing this morning, I saw cars following an ICE vehicle down the street honking at it. Later, we didn't drive more than 3 blocks where we found people defending a child care facility. The idea that people have to defend a child care facility, let that sink in. Half the street corners around here have people from every walk of life, including Republicans, standing guard to watch for suspicious vehicles, which are reported to a robust and entirely decentralized network that tracks ICE vehicles and mobilizes first responders. I have been actively involved in the protest movements for 24 years. I've never seen anything approaching this scale. Minneapolis is not accepting what's happening here. ICE fucking murdered a woman for participating in this, and all that did is bring more people from more walks of life. It's generally a leaderless or leaderful movement, decentralized in a way that the state is absolutely unquote to handle. There are a few basic skills involved, and so people treat each other those skills, and people are collectively refining them. Before I came, I looked over, asked a local friend at the cold. It's going to be nice 20 or so in the coming days. Would stop people from coming out. No, it'll be there. It's ICE who can't handle it. Today, and then I guess they have some more faults on that. I guess I think that but yeah, ultimately, I think the libertarian position that people do want to stand up against the state. I think they should be able to. With that being said, I personally don't really care for a lot of the anti-ICE protests in Minnesota because a lot of them were the ones who were demanding COVID authoritarianism, and it just goes to show the people will be against the state when it does something that they don't want it to do, but when it does something that they want it to do, they'll suddenly be licking the boot and demanding it crush dissent even harder than it currently is. And that's my thoughts there. Ultimately, people, if they want to justify protesting against ICE and having a resistance against ICE, I think it's able to. But it's important to remember that they might not be your friends all the time. You always have to question who your allies are in the fight for liberty. Because one day a friend in your fight for liberty might be an enemy in the next day. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, let's talk about Trump claiming victory over Greenland from, I think that's Bella the Ranch, formerly Below the Fifth Column on YouTube, posted by Damage 14. They added election summary of things and pay attention to the questions posted at the end. And yeah, personally, I think if Trump wants to say I've taken over Greenland, I think he should be able to. But I personally think the U.S. needs less foreign interventionism. But that Greenland is mostly just a Trumpian distraction to Iran, where the real regime change is happening. It's really just one of Trump's autistic hyperfixations, rather than an actual thing that a lot of Americans care about, and that's, I think, that important to remember as well. Next, we have Trump who campaigned on no new wars, and it says U.S. Armada is heading to Iran from NYTimes.com, posted by Row Run Row. And then they added another forever war that only benefits Israel. And I would agree with that. It just goes to show you that, a politician can say one thing, and then when they get elected, they'll often do the opposite things. And that just goes to show Trump might say, oh, no new wars. But Obama pretty much said the same thing. Oh, we gotta stop all this foreign interventionism, and he ended up being a foreign interventionist as well as countries like Libya, and that just goes to show you that it's they'll say one thing and then do the opposite when they actually get in power. That's why I'm very black-pilled, I would say, when it comes to politics as a whole. It's all just pretty much theater. MAGA might market itself as America First, non-interventionist, but in reality, it's just more deep state foreign interventionism. Next, we have Joe Rogan suggests Donald Trump is using ICE raids and fraud investigations to distract from Epstein files release. Some of that's on purpose from OKMagazine.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but I would agree with Rogan. A lot of things are just to distract from something else, and that's very much what Trump does. He's a master of always saying something outrageous and then letting that stay for the day, and then he says something else outrageous the next day, and people always just move on to whatever the next thing is, and that's very much what happened with the Epstein files. They were the thing everyone was talking about by December, but now the Venezuela regime changed, and the Iran regime changed, and the Greenland takeover. People have moved on. And that just goes to show that's very much how our news cycle works. It's very much the current thing. People always talk about what the current thing is, and then they move on to the next current thing. Next we have, he's so excited and he just can't hide it, posted by FlimsyAl5563, and that's cross-post from the TikTok cringe subreddit. And that looks like a TikTok from Now This Impact, and it looks like some nerdy Redditor saying, oh, I got my first AR, this man brought his first AR-15 after seeing ICE kidnapping people. And yeah, personally, I probably disagree with this guy on some issues, but he has every right to buy whatever gun he wants to, and that includes AR-15s. I was looking around the internet recently, and I saw a good shirt, Nobody needs an AR-15. Nobody needs a whiny little bitch either, yet here you are. My mom would never let me wear that shirt, but I thought that was a funny shirt. Ultimately, people should be able to use whatever weapons they want to, and, that's very much the libertarian position. The libertarian position is everyone has the right to use whatever weapons they want to, as long as to defend themselves, as long as they're not aggressing on other people. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then there was a post from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit I did that I wanted to share. I said, how have you been involved in the Libertarian Party over the years? I said, I'm coming up on my 5-year anniversary of leaving the Democratic Party and joining the Libertarian Party. I want to reflect on how I've been involved with the party so far and wanted to hear the experiences of other people as well in regards to their history with the party. In contrast to my 6 years as a Democrat, where I never really got all that involved with the party outside of voting for it, I've tried my best to get as involved with the Libertarian Party as much as possible. I've done some volunteer work like phone banking, and previously, I've tried running as a candidate on multiple occasions. I also have tried to be involved in my county chapter of the Libertarian Party as much as possible, and I have been its treasurer since 2024. I usually can't make our monthly in-person meetings since I can't drive. My friend who used to drive me moved out of the county. The same friend who was the one who drove me to the state convention 2022, which is the only state convention I've been to so far. So I usually just attend virtually via Jitsi, the county meetings, that is. I'll try to be active on the party subreddit and every social media channel as much as possible. Thoughts. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think, it's important to put yourself out there as much as possible. I'm naturally kind of an autistic loner, but I do try and put myself out there as much as possible. And people might not always like what I have to say, but I'm always trying to put myself out there and talk to as many people as possible and get as many perspectives as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.